7:49 a.m., Sunday, December 7th, 1941. Location, Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy base on Oahu, Hawaii. This is the moment the first wave of Japanese planes began their attack. In less than 2 hours, they carried out one of the most precise tactical victories in military history. So what led to the battle? The answer fits in a single word: oil. To protest Japan's war in China, the United States put a resource embargo in place, especially on oil, to choke the imperial war machine. Facing economic collapse, Japan's high command believed it had only one option: a sudden preemptive strike. Their plan, drawn up by Admiral Yamamoto, was elegant and dangerous. Knock out America's Pacific Fleet, numb the American will to fight, and buy a priceless 6-month window to grab oil and rubber across Southeast Asia. And they pulled it off in dramatic fashion. By late morning, 8 American battleships were sunk or badly damaged, hundreds of aircraft were destroyed, and more than 2,400 Americans were dead. Lieutenant Colonel Mitsuo Fuchida sent the victory signal, Tora, 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 Tiger, Tiger, Tiger. By every surface measure, this was a total victory, and that was also their greatest strategic mistake. This video is the story of that paradox, how a flawless victory planted the seed of total defeat. The answer is not in what was destroyed, it's in what was spared. A watch ticks under a thin skin of oil while the harbor burns bright. But up on the ridge above Battleship Row, white cylinders, fuel tanks, holding 4.5 million barrels, as big as buildings, shine in the sun. Not a single bomb touches them. Behind the smoke, the dry docks, the fleet's most critical repair shops, stand like open mouths ready to swallow broken steel. They are also untouched. And the 3 most valuable targets, the 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, Saratoga, aren't in port that day. They're out at sea, absent from the slaughter. By focusing on outdated battleships while sparing the fuel, the lifeblood of war sparing the repair yards, the places that heal wounds, and missing the carriers, the future of naval power. Japan won a morning but lost a war. That is the hinge. Those white tanks remained unharmed. The climax, many months later, would come when information industry and attrition met at a point on the map called Midway, a collision set in motion by the very things Japan chose not to destroy on its day of glory. On the deck of the Arizona hot air whistles, a boatswain's wrench clatters and disappears into rust-colored water. Sirens fade into the popping of ammunition, cooking inside turrets that suddenly feel like ovens. Lieutenant Colonel Mitsuo Fuchida circles high, calling Tora, 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 while the men trapped below lose their names and become numbers. From up here, the harbor looks like a problem already solved. Down at street level, it looks like a job that has to begin right now. Tugboats shove blackened hulls toward the dry docks where hoses, pumps, and welding torches, ordinary tools, turn into strategy. In Tokyo, staff officers pin red flags along a wall map like a rosary of inevitable wins: Guam, Wake, Hong Kong, Malaya, the Indies. In Washington, the president signs declarations. In Detroit and Seattle, whistles call a second shift and managers sharpen pencils. America is shocked into unity. Japan's plan is elegant in the way dangerous ideas often are. Strike first hard and far, seize belts of oil and rubber, build a fortified island barrier, force talks before American factories can run hot. Admiral Yamamoto, a gambler who had counted America's cards during his time in the States, gave a warning his subordinates heard but didn't fully accept. For 6 months, we can run wild. After that, the balance shifts. Pearl Harbor was meant to buy those 6 months, and it did. But the purchase was poisoned. At the source, the wrong target survived. The World War that followed was not decided by the clean beauty of a tactical blow, but by the resilience of systems, fuel, machine shops, code rooms, pilot schools that fill the hours between battles. On Ford Island, a petty officer makes an uncinematic observation. The cranes are fine. Cranes matter. Salvage crews, sleepless and hoarse, chalk lines on scorched decks and argue over the order of welds. Nevada will steam again. West Virginia will rise. Liberty ships start sliding down greased ways like loaves out of an oven. The Two-Ocean Navy Act, signed months before the attack, now explodes industrially. Hull numbers soar. Essex-class carriers move from paper to keel blocks. Destroyers with radar roll out of shipyards that learn to treat steel like cloth. On another island, far more anonymous than Oahu Navy codebreakers at station Hypo chew pencils and pipe stems while wrestling the JN-25 code. They are bookish men with bad posture. They will change the map. In early 1942, Japanese pilots are the best naval aviators on Earth, trained to a razor's edge. The Zero dances in a sky it seems to own. Yet every victory is a wound when replacements can't be trained as fast as losses. Fuel is rationed, instructors can't be replaced, and the syllabus is long. The imperial doctrine, Kantai Kessen, the decisive, perfectly staged battle, was built for a duel of fleets and for a time before radar and mass production. America doesn't duel. America mobilizes. It fights with rivet guns, ledgers, and an endless supply of new hands who learn fast because training is standardized and gasoline is there. Faith in a single cleansing climax runs head-on into a reality where battles add up like work shifts on a factory floor. The victory at Pearl Harbor also did America a service that Japan never intended. It erased political hesitation. Isolationist speeches turned into museum pieces overnight. A sailor's blood on a ladder made a better argument than any party platform. The national talk boiled down into action items. Scheduling boards clattered. Purchasing officers discovered that impossible often meant we haven't asked urgently enough. Salvage became strategy. Repair became deterrence. The smell of burned paint became a reminder that the job wasn't mourning, it was multiplication. Down in Hypo's basement, someone marks AF and someone else writes short of water, and a simple trick, an unclassified report about a water shortage at Midway sent to bait Japanese communications confirms the target. Nimitz gets the kind of information admirals dream about dates. American ships sail not only to fight, but to wait in the right place. Yorktown, patched in a hard-to-believe 3 days, wears a new skin like a half-healed scar and still heads out. When Fuchida's peers sortie for Midway with Akagi Kagasoryu and Hiryu, the Japanese fleet carries the same flaw that gleamed white on the ridge above Pearl Trust in a beautiful blow and blindness to the systems that let your enemy hit back. The Hook, the unbombed fuel farm, has already curved quietly toward the climax. From high above the Pacific on a June morning looks like polished steel smooth enough to lie about distance and fate. The Japanese order of battle at Midway reads like a chess problem, solved in advanced carriers at center, battleships in guarding arcs, cruisers and destroyers in neat rings, scouts spreading out like the hands of a clock. The Americans arrive with fewer hulls, and an advantaged sentry eyes can't see they know roughly where and when to wait. That knowledge didn't come from oracles, but from clerks and mathematicians who turned habit and paperwork into calendar entries. On that patient, boring foundation, Nimitz lays his risk. The first American torpedo squadrons find the enemy and pay a terrible tuition. Devastators lumber in low and slow into interceptors that tear them into flame. Men die in white wakes that disappear even as they're made. Above them, higher than anybody dares hope, a cloverleaf of SBD dive bombers searches a grid the size of an ocean. For long minutes that feel like a lost day, nothing shows where it should. Then a scout spots a speck in a wake. Radios spit coordinates. The SBDs roll over and fall. On the Japanese decks, the math of a split plan rearming for a second strike on Midway, while getting ready for carrier battle, has produced a deadly still life bombs on carts, torpedoes on racks, hoses stinking of gasoline planes, loaded with intent but not yet with purpose. In 20 minutes, the war tilts. Akagi Kaga and Soryu go from sovereign machines to furnaces. The explosions don't play like drama to the men working hoses. They play like heat that steals the air from your lungs. Hiryu fights on land's heavy punches and dies to complete the set. Along with them go pilots whose hours can't be invented, and mechanics whose hands can't be cloned. Midway isn't an ending. It's the moment Japanese naval aviation loses the future. America still has to prove endurance in the jungle and in the slot. But a doctrine built around a decisive battle gets answered by a decisive attrition, not just ships sunk, but training cut short. Not just planes burned, but the pipeline squeezed. Guadalcanal follows like a fever. The runway at Henderson Field becomes an altar to logistics where everything that lands, fuel drums, crates of spark plugs, radio batteries, counts as strategy. The Cactus Air Force runs on fumes and stubbornness, flying antiques and small miracles. The Tokyo Express runs by night destroyers shoving white bow waves, delivering men and rice at costs they can't sustain. Radar crawls onto American bridges like a new sense. Rangefinders learn to swallow night. Destroyer captains learn to charge straight into chaos. At Savo Island, the Japanese punish American inexperience. At Cape Esperance and Tassafaranga, they hit and slip away. But every week, the numbers lean more toward America. Pilots rotate in rested and taught. The Zero meets the F-4F Wildcat, and then the F-6F Hellcat, and discovers the sky has rules different from the ones it wrote in 1941. On a map, these months look like arrows and dots. On the ground, they sound like a generator, coughing to life, and they smell like old gasoline in canvas. In a corrugated hut near the runway, a corporal stamps a request for engine parts, and as a half-joke writes as many as you can spare. Somewhere in San Diego, a clerk reads the form and doesn't laugh. Spare is now the default. The United States has become a machine that solves logistics with more logistics. Essex-class carriers start showing up like a trick the magician keeps repeating. Light carriers fill gaps. Fast battleships, once skeptical of airplanes, now wear radar and throw steel roses into the air with directors that think faster than human eyes. American submarines, once unlucky, learn their trade with hard-nosed economy. Torpedoes that once ran too deep start working. Skippers adjust doctrine. Patrol reports thicken with the names of tankers that burn to the waterline. Japan's anti-submarine warfare stays thin in doctrine and short on gear. Oil, the whole point of the Southern War, starts going missing in all the wrong places inside boilers that cool early, inside classrooms that want long training flights, but settle for traffic patterns inside the veins of a fleet that needs to sprint, but more and more has to walk. A doctrine that promised one clean decision is now bleeding out through 10,000 small cuts. Back in Tokyo, staff optimism tries to outvote math. Army and Navy fight over priorities like brothers in a crowded house. Flight schools shorten courses and graduate men who need sky they won't get. Maintenance crews invent tools without raw materials. Engineers write memos no one can fulfill. The empire still has courage and lovely phrases. It has islands that look big on a wall map and small through a gun sight. It has no way to change the slope of the graph. By 1944, the war changes color. The U.S. fast carrier task forces roam like weather systems with names. In the Marianas, American pilots fly planes designed to be repaired by folks who call their tools by first names. They launch under a radar umbrella guided by voice nets that sound like small talk until you listen for the choreography. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot is a crude nickname born in cockpits, but that sky earns the cruelty Japanese squadrons, flying fewer hours on less fuel, climb into an environment that belongs to discipline and electronics now. Many never find a target. Those that do meet fighters lifted and steered into place with a precision that used to live only in theory. The losses aren't just numbers, they're the last pages of an old syllabus blown out of a teacher's hands. The United States is now making more carriers than Japan can find adjectives to describe. Essex decks fill with planes arriving in wooden crates like flat-pack superiority. Air group commanders rotate home to teach seeding new squadrons with men who've seen and survived the zeros curve and can teach the plain truth. Don't turn with him. Dive, climb, fight vertically. Japan still has artisans and the Yamato, a battleship so huge it intimidates the word ship, yet it sails in a world that has turned its back on the big gun. Without carrier cover, a superlative hull is a floating museum looking for a storm to hide in. Leyte Gulf becomes a test of invention and will. Japan's plan draw the American carriers away with decoys while battleships stab at the landing beaches has grace and desperation in equal parts. The execution becomes a legend, half earned and half escaped. Kurita's center force, thundering through a gauntlet, then stumbling into Taffy 3, escort carriers and destroyers that on paper are prey. The Americans improvise with such ferocity, it looks like hallucination destroyers laying smoke. Charging battleships firing torpedoes at knife range. Small carriers launching every plane that can fly with whatever ordnance is bolted underneath. In the fog of war, Kurita turns away. In the scorebook, the result reads like courage out-wrestling confusion. In the economics of the fight, it reads like something else, Japan gambling capital ships against an enemy who can be surprised and still win by showing up again tomorrow. Under the sea, the choke tightens. Submarines stalk the lanes from the Indies to the home islands and erase tankers by the calendar. The heartbeat of a diesel engine, once comforting, turns into a countdown for convoy commanders who never learned to hunt back. Japanese yards can't replace merchant hulls or their cargo. Fuel rationing moves from annoyance to destiny. Training flights shorten like winter days. A flight instructor writes in neat characters that today's class flew 30 minutes. The line in the book ought to read 6 hours. From the Marianas, B-29s lift like omens with wings. Strategic bombing aims first at precision and then grimly at fire. Cities catch, wooden houses pass flames along, night turns to noon at temperatures that eat oxygen and then hope. These raids don't kill the Imperial Navy. They amputate the nation's ability to teach repair and feed. Surrender is a word no one wants to write. Impossibility is a reality the charts already show. In August 1945, atomic bombs turned the vocabulary into something the mind resists. And as if the ledger needed another line, the Soviet Union enters the war in the north. Closing exits, Japan hoped courtesy might leave ajar. The decisive battle, promised by doctrine, did come, but it didn't look like Tsushima reborn. It looked like Midway's 20 minutes of ignition, Guadalcanal's long grinding months, the Marianas' day of culling Leyte's improvisation, and the unseen math of tankers, sunken nights no camera could capture. It looked like a nation turning grief into output and output into learning. Pearl Harbor framed the question. The factories answered it. The code breakers, pilots, and machinists repeated it until even the strongest adjective got tired. In a Kansas warehouse, a woman bucking rivets on a B-29 wing slips and laughs, then steadies the tool and finds her rhythm again. In a Pittsburgh foundry, a ladle pours light that cools into a crankshaft, destined for destroyer escort no novelist ever names. In a submarine off Borneo, a skipper steadies his periscope, whispers a range, and watches a tanker lift out of the water on a pillar of its own fire. None of them ever saw those white tanks above Pearl Harbor. All of them were answering them. The Empire fights on after Leyte creatures of honor and momentum. A new horror appears in the form of pilots who take off with just enough fuel to reach a target and not enough to come home. Americans answer with thicker, flak, longer fighter sweeps and a discipline born of having to be brave every day, not just once. Yamato sails on her last run to Okinawa, like a king without a kingdom found and drowned by airplanes that no longer seem like machines, but like sentences written in a language the battleship can't learn. Even this last grand show, this floating cathedral, goes under in a blizzard of explosions that record not just destruction, but the obsolescence of an idea. Here the argument settles into 5 clear reasons the story has already shown. First, Pearl Harbor delivered a tactical masterpiece while preserving the opponent's strategic nervous system, fuel farms, dry docks, and, by luck and timing, carriers. That spared infrastructure turned grief into restored hulls, then into more hulls than the math had expected. Second, American industry scaled up to a tempo that couldn't be bombed once it got going. Standardized training pipelines, women in factories, and a continent's resources turned outrage into leverage. Third, Japanese doctrine and inter-service rivalry. Kantai Kessen, married to Army-Navy infighting, favored the pretty battle over the ugly necessary work of convoy protection, pilot replacement, and anti-submarine warfare. Fourth, information and electronics. Chaipio's decrypts shipboard radar and fighter direction shifted the edge to those who could see first and coordinate better. Fifth, oil. Japan went to war for it and then lost it at sea watching tankers die, until even the best instructors had to ration the hours that make a pilot lethal. Each reason touches people. A code clerk with a chewed pencil underlines AF and changes a week. A welder at Pearl drags a bead along a seam and changes a month. A foreman signing for a shipment of carbide tools in Cleveland changes a year. A submarine crew rolling a torpedo in its cradle changes a convoy's odds of arriving. A pilot who lives long enough to teach 3 classes changes how an air group flies. War isn't a duel. It's a choir that swells or thins, depending on who can still sing on Thursday. Atomic bombs finished the sentence. B-29s began, but even without them, the slope already pointed down. The Soviet entry erases the last diplomatic daydream. The emperor speaks in a voice most of his people have never heard, and asks them to endure the unendurable. In that speech, many hear both an ending and a kind of absolution. At Pearl Harbor, a rusted anchor becomes a lawn ornament for remembrance. Tourists smile in photos with a calm that feels like another kind of victory, the right to go home in time for dinner. It's tempting to say fate did the work or pride. But the better explanation is stubbornly specific. At dawn on December the 7th, 1941, Japan struck brilliantly at the wrong set of targets. By sparing fuel, dry docks, and carriers, and by reading America as a nation that would seek compromise after a shock, the empire built a tactical legend on a strategic mistake. Everything after that mistake magnified its cost. Midway burned the irreplaceable. Guadalcanal bled the doctrine. The Marianas and Leyte erased the remaining capital. Submarines strangled the economy. Radar and code breaking guided hands to the right levers, factories fed grief into numbers. The footage looks tidy now in documentaries, but it wasn't tidy then. Weather lied. Radios failed. People improvised. Officers guessed. A petty officer found a crane that still worked and started it. The crew chief on Yorktown signed off on repairs that should have taken weeks. A destroyer captain off Samar charged what he should have run from. A young Japanese flight instructor kept a brave face while telling students to fly a pattern that barely counted as training. A clerk in Tokyo lowered the ration for aviation fuel and went home in silence. In their scatter, the pattern comes clear. Japan could win a morning with excellence. America could win a year with endurance. In the end, the story folds back to the simple echo of the opening hook. On the ridge above Battleship Row, those white fuel tanks reflected the winter sun. No bomb fell on them. No machine gun pocked them. The cranes behind them could still swing. The carriers they would feed could still come home. Those spared things, tanks, docks, decks, aren't romantic and don't make posters. But they decided who owned the rest of the calendar. Japan's victory at Pearl Harbor was the cleanest cut of the war. America's answer was to clot harden and grow new muscle around the wound while still throwing punches. By the time surrender came in August 1945, the decisive battle had been fought not once but many times in skies at sea, in factories, and in code rooms, all humming the same tune. Tactics can shock a giant. Only strategy keeps him down. On the lawn at Pearl Harbor, a child climbs the rusted anchor and laughs a sound that doesn't check with history books. Somewhere else, a veteran hears that laughter, and for the first time in years doesn't flinch. The harbor is quiet. The watch that once ticked in oil has long since stopped. In place of its rhythm, we're left with a different measure, the simple, unglamorous beat of a system that survived the first punch and then learned faster than the opponent could replace what that punch cost. That is why Japan won at Pearl Harbor and still lost to America in the war, and why the lesson for all its film and fire is finally about what you choose to spare and what you can't afford to misunderstand. Years after the smoke left the sky, the map remains a palimpsest of pins, arrows, and dates that guide museum docents more than admirals. In one corner, a docent taps the glass with a pencil and tells a row of students that the fuel tanks were never bombed. In another, an old man with careful hands explains how long it takes to straighten a bent shaft. A younger woman asks why anyone thought a single battle could decide a modern war. The answer comes in two parts, because the last war offered a tempting example, and because the math of factories hides inside numbers until someone teaches you how to read it. The film reels show the explosions. The ledgers show the end. Fuchida writes memoirs where the first day tastes like victory and the later pages taste like salt. Nimitz retires to a home where the phone hardly rings and the sea is a blue beyond the window, not an order. A machinist from the Pearl Dry Dock sends both sons to college. They never have to pronounce Midway with a question mark. A Japanese instructor who once wrote 30 minutes of fuel in his log becomes a farmer who measures rain with the patience he once saved for gasoline. The submarine skipper who sank a tanker stays quiet for decades, then tells his granddaughter that nothing in his life was ever as loud as the sound of an oil fire seen through a narrow circle of glass. If you need to keep one picture, it's the white cylinders on the ridge at noon untouched. If you need one sentence, it's the one that ties them to a nation that could fix as fast as it could rage, then learn as fast as it could fix. If you need a phrase for why a morning's triumph led to surrender 3 years later, it's this: a perfect tactic serving a flawed strategy. The hook at Pearl Harbor led to the climax at Midway and beyond. And the revelation wasn't mystical logistics, information, replacements, and fuel are the organs of victory after the fireworks end. Japan was extraordinary at the first blow. America proved inexhaustible at everything that followed. In that contrast lies the explanation for the paradox that drew you in at the start. The question is honest. The answer is plural. The lesson is practical. When the next visitor stands before the glass and asks gently how it happened this way, the docent will draw a small circle on the map where the fuel tanks are, and then trace a wide arc from Kansas to Hawaii, to the Solomons, to the Marianas, to Tokyo. The circle is what Japan left. The arc is what America built. Between them sits the story. If this story pulled you in, subscribe for more World War II tales that blend hard history with human stakes. And tell us in the comments which moment turned the war in your eyes, the 20 minutes over Midway, or the years of merchant ships burned unseen on the Pacific.